The ton said Edmund Ashford grieved like a man who had truly loved. They were wrong. He stood at the edge of Lady Pemworth's drawing room with a glass of brandy he hadn't touched, watching the candlelight fracture across the ceiling, and felt, as he had felt every single day for 3 years, absolutely nothing. No grief. No longing. No hollow ache where a wife should have been. Only guilt. Which, he had learned, was so much harder to mourn. It was his cousin Aldrich who finally broke through. Not with sentiment, Aldrich knew better than that. Not with logic either, because Edmund had dismantled every logical argument for re-entering society with the same quiet precision he applied to everything else. What Aldrich used, in the end, was something far more effective. Your silence is becoming its own kind of scandal, Edmund. They were in the study at Renmore House, the curtains drawn against the February afternoon as they always were these days. Edmund sat behind his desk with a letter he hadn't been reading for the past 20 minutes. Aldrich sat across from him, uninvited, as he always was. "Let them talk," Edmund said. "They already do. Endlessly." Aldrich leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees with the casual ease of a man who had never once taken a social slight personally. "But there is talking, and then there is speculation. Right now, Edmund, they have moved from the former into the latter. Lady Harcastle told 3 separate people last week that she believes you've gone mad with grief. Lord Fenwick's wife, God help us, wrote a poem about you. It was read aloud at a dinner party." Edmund looked up from the letter. "A poem. 4 stanzas. She compared you to Orpheus." Aldrich paused. "Unfavorably, in the end. Apparently you lack his courage." The silence that followed was the particular kind that only existed between 2 men who had known each other since boyhood, dense with things unsaid, but not uncomfortably so. Edmund set down the letter. "One evening," Aldrich said, pressing the advantage with practiced subtlety. "Lady Pemworth's supper. 12 guests, no dancing, no spectacle. You appear, you survive 2 hours of polite conversation, and the poems stop. And if I find it unbearable?" Aldrich smiled. "Then you leave. You're a duke, Edmund. You can do anything. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." He arrived late, because arriving late meant less time inside. Lady Pemworth's townhouse was modest by Mayfair standards: warm candlelight, fresh flowers that smelled faintly of hothouse roses, the low murmur of 12 people who had known each other long enough to be comfortable but not long enough to be honest. A safe gathering. Curated, as all of Aldrich's suggestions tended to be. Edmund stood in the doorway for one long moment before anyone noticed him. Then they all noticed him at once. He watched it happen, the slight shift in posture, the interruption of mid-sentence conversations, the careful recalibration of expressions into something that wanted to be sympathy but landed closer to fascination. He was used to it. He had been used to it for 3 years. The Duke in mourning. The tragic figure. The man who loved so deeply that society itself held its breath waiting for him to return. He smiled the smile he had perfected in the mirror of Renmore House. Composed. Quietly bereaved. Grateful for their concern. He crossed the room to greet his hostess and felt like a man performing a role in a play he had not auditioned for. Lady Pemworth had placed him near the fireplace, a kindness, he suspected, since it gave him something to look at besides the other guests. He accepted a glass of wine from a passing footman, turned toward the warmth of the fire, and began the familiar work of being present without actually being there. He had grown very good at this. The other guests arranged themselves around him in careful orbits, close enough to demonstrate their sympathy, far enough to avoid the specific awkwardness of not knowing what to say to a man whose wife had been dead for 3 years. They spoke about the unusually cold winter. About Lord Ashby's new horses. About the upcoming season and who among the younger set showed the most promise. Edmund responded when spoken to. He asked questions he didn't care about the answers to. He laughed, once, at something that warranted laughing at. And then he heard her. Not loudly, she wasn't the kind of woman who spoke loudly. She was seated near the window with an older woman Edmund didn't recognize, and she was talking to a young man who had clearly just said something he considered very impressive. "That's a very confident assessment," she said, "for someone who has read only one side of the argument." The young man, Viscount Hale's second son, Edmund thought, though he couldn't be certain, blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Lord Fenwick's pamphlet. You quoted it just now as though it were settled fact, but it was written in response to Morland's earlier essay, which argues the opposite with considerably more evidence." She said it without malice, without performance, in the same tone one might use to point out that someone had a smudge on their cravat. "I only mention it because you seem genuinely interested in the subject. Morland is worth reading." The young man opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Yes. Thank you." She turned back to her companion and resumed a conversation that had apparently been more interesting anyway. Edmund realized he had stopped pretending to look at the fire. Aldrich appeared at his elbow with the timing he had always possessed. "Her name is Isolde Vane. Father was a solicitor, quite well regarded before his health declined. She's here with her sister, the pretty one by the settee, the one Pemworth is trying to introduce to young Ashfield." "I wasn't asking," Edmund said. "No," Aldrich agreed. "You were staring, which is considerably more telling." Edmund looked away from her. Looked back at the fire. Drank his wine with the measured composure of a man who was absolutely not thinking about the expression on Hale's son's face, that particular combination of deflation and reluctant gratitude, and the fact that it was the first genuinely amusing thing he had witnessed in longer than he cared to calculate. "She has no particular prospects," Aldrich continued, in the tone of a man who was merely thinking aloud. "The family needs a good match for the sister, which is the primary purpose of this season. Miss Vane herself seems," he paused, searching, "uninterested in performing." "Uninterested in performing," Edmund repeated. "You know what I mean. She doesn't do the thing." Aldrich gestured vaguely. "The calculated softness. The practiced helplessness. She just says what she thinks." Edmund said nothing. But he didn't look away from the fire again for the rest of the evening. It happened near the end of the night, in the narrow corridor outside the drawing room where Edmund had retreated for 10 minutes of silence. He heard her before he saw her, quick footsteps, the soft rustle of a dress, and then she came around the corner and stopped when she found him standing there, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the way two people do when they have both been caught doing the same thing for different reasons. "Forgive me," she said. "I needed a moment away from." She stopped. Glanced back toward the drawing room. "The sympathy." Edmund raised an eyebrow. "The sympathy. Lady Pemworth's guests are very kind," Isolde Vane said, in a tone that suggested she found kindness exhausting under certain conditions. "But they have been explaining my own family's financial situation to me all evening with great feeling, and I've run out of gracious responses." He almost smiled. He caught it before it happened, but it was a near thing. "I know the feeling," he said, before he could decide not to. She looked at him then, really looked at him, in the direct and slightly unsettling way he had observed from across the room. Not with pity, which he expected. Not with the romantic fascination that younger women occasionally turned on him, which he found worse. With something that was closer, he thought, to simple assessment. "I imagine you do," she said. "Although in your case, I suspect the sympathy is for something that doesn't quite," she paused. Seemed to reconsider. "I'm sorry. That was impertinent." The corridor was very quiet. "Finish it," Edmund said. She met his eyes. "I only meant that grief, when it's genuine, tends to make people want to be less visible. Not invisible exactly, but inward. Private." She said it carefully, not cruelly. "You don't grieve like a man who is grieving. You grieve like a man who is very good at looking like one." The silence that followed was the longest Edmund had experienced in recent memory. He should have been offended. He was aware of this. Any reasonable man would have been, a woman he had never met, at a dinner party, in a corridor, delivering a quiet and precise dismantling of the performance he had spent 3 years perfecting. Instead he felt, for the first time in longer than he could name, something that was not numbness. "You're right," he said. She blinked. She had not expected that. "I am very good at looking like one," he said, and looked at her with the first honest expression he had worn all evening. "You're the first person who has noticed." She said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "I think perhaps that's the saddest thing about it." She excused herself and walked back toward the drawing room, and Edmund stood alone in the corridor for a long time afterward, holding his untouched wine, thinking that Aldrich, damn him, had been right about one thing. He had needed to come tonight after all. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. London had a story about Edmund Ashford, and London loved it. It went like this: the Duke of Renmore had married young, and beautifully, and with the kind of devotion that the Tuns secretly believed only existed in novels. When his Duchess died, a fever, they said, sudden and merciless, he had retreated from society entirely. 3 years of black. 3 years of silence. 3 years of a man so destroyed by loss that he could not bear to re-enter the world she had once occupied. It was, by any measure, a magnificent story. Lady Harcastle told it at breakfast tables. Mrs. Fenwick had written the poem. Young girls in their first season whispered about it with a particular breathless reverence, the way one whispers about anything beautiful and untouchable. Even the older women, the pragmatic ones, the ones who had survived enough seasons to be suspicious of romance in all its forms, softened slightly when Edmund's name came up. He loved her so, they said. He has never recovered, they said. There will never be another, they said, and somehow this made them happy rather than sad, because a man capable of loving that completely was proof of something they needed to believe in. Isolde Vane heard this story 4 times in the first 2 weeks of the season. Each time, she said nothing. She smiled the appropriate smile and made the appropriate sounds of agreement and thought, privately, about the corridor outside Lady Pemworth's drawing room, and the way Edmund Ashford had said "you're right" with the exhausted relief of a man setting down something very heavy. Men destroyed by grief did not say "you're right" like that. Men destroyed by grief did not look at you with eyes that were not sad so much as they were tired. She kept this observation to herself. She was, by both necessity and nature, good at keeping things to herself. The season had its own machinery, and Isolde had been inserted into it for a single purpose, Clara. Her sister was everything the season required. Soft-spoken and genuinely lovely, with the kind of unforced sweetness that couldn't be manufactured and the additional advantage of being entirely unaware of her own appeal. Clara deserved a good match. Clara deserved someone kind who would appreciate her. And since their father's health had taken the family's finances somewhere dark and quiet, a good match was no longer simply desirable. It was necessary. Isolde had understood this before anyone said it aloud. She had packed her one good evening gown and her 3 serviceable day dresses and come to London with her eyes open, and she had decided somewhere between the carriage ride and the first ball that she would be useful and unobtrusive and cause no trouble whatsoever. She had not planned on Edmund Ashford. They kept encountering each other. This was, on the surface, unremarkable. London's season operated within a tight geography, the same drawing rooms, the same parks, the same succession of balls and musicales and afternoon calls that constituted the whole of fashionable life. Everyone encountered everyone eventually. But there was encountering, and then there was this. The first time was at Hyde Park, 3 days after Lady Pemworth's supper. Isolde was walking with Clara along the Serpentine while Clara talked about a young Mr. Ashfield who had been very attentive and had nice eyes, and Isolde was listening with genuine interest because Clara's happiness was the whole point of this enterprise, and then she looked up and Edmund Ashford was riding toward them on a grey horse and he saw her at exactly the same moment. He slowed. This surprised her. She had expected him to ride past with a polite nod, the nod of a duke who had briefly spoken to a nobody in a corridor and had since filed the experience away appropriately. Instead he stopped, dismounted with the fluid ease of a man who had been on horseback since childhood, and walked toward them. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she said, and introduced Clara, who was delightful and warm and said all the right things, and Edmund was courteous and attentive in the way of a man who had been raised to be both, and none of it was what interested Isolde. What interested Isolde was the moment before he put the courtesy on, the single unguarded second when he first looked at her, and something in his expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite name. Not attraction, exactly. Or not only that. Recognition, perhaps. The particular relief of seeing someone who already knew your secret. They spoke for perhaps 5 minutes. He asked about her impressions of the season with what seemed like genuine curiosity. She answered honestly, which meant she made him almost smile twice. Clara watched this exchange with the quiet attention of a younger sister filing information away for later. When he rode on, Clara said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then, "He looked at you very strangely." "He looks at everyone strangely," Isolde said. "He's been in mourning for 3 years." Clara considered this. "No," she said, with the serene certainty she occasionally produced on matters of feeling. "Not like that." The second encounter was at a musicale at Lord Ashby's townhouse, where Isolde had positioned herself near the back because the soprano was excellent and she wanted to listen without performing appreciation. Edmund arrived late and, finding every other seat occupied, sat 2 chairs away from her with the expression of a man who had not expected this and was not displeased by it. They did not speak during the performance. Afterward, in the shuffling reorganization of guests, he appeared at her side. "What did you think?" he asked, without preamble. "Of the soprano?" "Exceptional." The pianist overplayed in the second movement, he was competing with her instead of supporting her. She paused. "What did you think?" "The same," he said, and there was a warmth in it that hadn't been there at Lady Pemworth's. Something slightly less armored. Almost no one noticed. They were watching Lady Ashby watch the soprano. Much more entertaining. He did smile then, briefly, controlled, but genuine. It changed his face entirely. She understood suddenly why the Ton had built a myth around him, because when Edmund Ashford was not performing grief he was, she searched for the word, present in a way that commanded attention without demanding it. She looked away first, which was the sensible thing to do. It was Isolde's habit, in houses she visited often enough, to be pleasant to the staff. Not performatively pleasant, not the calculated warmth of women who understood that servants talked, but genuinely so, because she found people interesting and people were people regardless of their position. This habit, in the 3rd week of the season, produced information she had not sought. She was at Lady Aldrich's for an afternoon call, Aldrich being Edmund's cousin, whose wife had taken a mild interest in Clara's prospects, when she found herself in the hallway waiting for her police with one of the older housemaids, a woman named Mrs. Poole who had been in service long enough to have opinions. They spoke about the cold. About the difficulty of keeping fires going in old houses. And then Mrs. Poole, in the way of women who had been silent about something for too long, said, "You're acquainted with the Duke of Renmore, aren't you, miss?" "Slightly," Isolde said, carefully. Mrs. Poole was quiet for a moment. "I was in service at Renmore House. Before." She folded her hands in her apron. "The late Duchess was, she was not happy. I say that only because they all say he loved her so, and I think," she stopped. "I think it wasn't like that. Not for either of them." Isolde said nothing, because saying nothing was the correct response. "She was very alone," Mrs. Poole said finally. "And he couldn't reach her. Not for lack of trying, at the end. But some distances," she shook her head. "I shouldn't speak of it." "No," Isolde agreed quietly. "But thank you." She walked home through the cold afternoon thinking about distances that couldn't be crossed, and a man who wore his guilt as mourning because mourning was the only version of it society would accept. It was raining the evening of the Cavendish ball, which meant the carriages were backed up the length of the street and everyone arrived damp and irritable, and the first hour was spent in the collective performance of not minding. Isolde minded, but only because her one good evening gown now had a hem that would spend the rest of the night pretending it hadn't met a puddle. She was standing at the edge of the ballroom, her habitual position, which allowed observation without participation, when Edmund found her. Not by accident this time. He moved through the room with the directness of a man who had decided something and was acting before he could reconsider. "You're cataloguing again," he said, stopping beside her. "I prefer observing." "What's the difference?" "Cataloguing implies judgment. Observing is just paying attention." She glanced at him. He was in black, as always, but he wore it differently than he had a month ago. Less like armor. "You look like you've decided something." He was quiet for a moment. Around them the ball moved in its great slow orbit, music, laughter, the careful negotiations of the season playing out in every corner. "The story they tell about me," he said, finally. "The grief. The devotion." He didn't look at her. "You know it isn't true." "I suspected," she said. "I didn't know. I didn't love her." He said it in the same tone one might use to report the weather, flat, factual, the tone of a man who had said this to himself so many times that the words had worn smooth. "We were suited on paper. The match made sense. We were civil, for a time. But she was unhappy long before I understood why, and he stopped. I was not what she needed. And I knew it, and I told myself it would improve, and it didn't." Isolde said nothing. This, she had learned, was what he needed, not response, but witness. "When she died," he said, "everyone assumed I was devastated. It was easier to let them." He paused. "It was cowardly. It was human," Isolde said quietly. He looked at her then. Directly, in the way he rarely looked at anyone, without the performance, without the careful management. "You do that," he said. "Do what?" "Say the precise thing that makes it worse and better simultaneously." She felt something shift in the careful distance she had been maintaining. Something that she recognized and did not entirely welcome, because it complicated everything. "I should find Clara," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't move. Neither did she, for 3 more seconds than was sensible. Then she did find Clara, and the evening continued, and the rain outside didn't stop until almost midnight. Edmund's mother had been watching. This was her primary occupation, had been for years, and she was exceptionally good at it. Lady Cressida Ashford noticed things other people missed: the second glance, the almost smile, the particular quality of attention a man paid to a woman when he believed no one was observing him. She noticed all of it with Edmund. And she felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not quite hope and not quite fear but contained elements of both. The vain girl was a problem. Not because she was unsuitable, though she was, by the cold mathematics of their world, entirely unsuitable, but because she was perceptive. And a perceptive woman, given enough time and enough of Edmund's unguarded moments, would eventually ask the question that must never be answered. Not why did you stay with a woman you didn't love? The other question. The darker one. The one that, if it ever reached the surface, would not destroy only Edmund. Lady Cressida set down her tea and began to think about how to manage this carefully. Edmund had not told her everything. He had told her the surface of it, the loveless marriage, the guilt, the performance of grief. He had told her more than he had told anyone in 3 years, and it had felt, inexplicably, like setting down a coat he had forgotten he was wearing. But there was a room in the history of his marriage that he had not opened for anyone. A letter he had read and burned and never spoken of. A conversation with his mother, 2 days after the funeral, that had ended with both of them choosing silence so completely that neither had broken it since. He hadn't told her that. He wasn't sure he could. But for the first time, walking home through London streets that had finally dried after the rain, he thought that perhaps, there was someone who could hear it. He was not used to that feeling. He was not sure if it frightened him more than the alternative. She chose a Tuesday morning, which was deliberate. Tuesday mornings were when Isolde took Clara to the modiste on Bond Street, a small ritual Cressida had learned from the kind of quiet observation she had practiced for 40 years. She arranged to be there herself, which required manufacturing a reason, which she did without difficulty because manufacturing reasons was something she had always been very good at. The shop was warm and smelled of fresh fabric and the particular industry of women who understood that appearance was its own form of power. Clara was being fitted for a pale yellow muslin that would do excellent things for her complexion. Isolde sat nearby with a book she wasn't reading, because Isolde was always slightly watchful in public spaces, always slightly on duty. Cressida sat beside her and opened with something innocuous. The weather. The season. A mild observation about the yellow muslin. Isolde responded with the pleasant attentiveness of a woman who knew she was being approached but not yet why. "My son speaks of you," Cressida said, eventually. A pause. Barely perceptible. "That's very kind of him." "It isn't kindness. Edmund doesn't speak of anyone." Cressida kept her voice warm, which was the important thing, warm and faintly sorrowful, the voice of a mother who wanted only good things. "That's what concerns me, Miss Vane." Isolde closed her book. "I'm not sure I understand." "He is fragile," Cressida said, which was so far from the truth that saying it almost amused her. 3 years is a long time to grieve, but grief of that depth leaves marks that don't simply disappear because a man begins to smile again. "I have watched my son very carefully." She paused. "I would hate for him to form an attachment that complicated his recovery." The sentence landed the way she intended it to, gently, with plausible concern, and with its real meaning tucked just far enough inside the gentle concern to require no acknowledgement. "You are not suitable. You will not be permitted. Step back." Isolde was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate your candor," she said finally, in a tone that was perfectly pleasant and entirely opaque. Cressida smiled. "I thought you would. You strike me as a practical woman." She left shortly afterward, satisfied. She did not see Isolde's expression in the moment after the shop door closed. Isolde sat very still for 10 seconds. Then she picked up her book, opened it to the page she had not been reading, and thought about the word fragile and all the ways it had not described Edmund Ashford in any of the conversations she had held with him. She thought about Lady Pemworth's corridor. The Cavendish ball. The way he said you say the precise thing that makes it worse and better simultaneously with the expression of a man who hadn't expected to be known. She thought about Mrs. Poole, and distances that couldn't be crossed, and the letter that was in Edmund's past that she didn't know about yet but felt the shape of. And she thought about a woman who called her son fragile with warm eyes and no real warmth behind them, and what that woman might be protecting. Not Edmund, she thought. Herself. She didn't go looking for it. This was important, she told herself this afterward, in the way one reconstructs events to establish one's own innocence. She did not go looking for it. It came to her through a sequence of accidents that she would later identify as the particular cruelty of timing. It was Aldrich who was responsible, indirectly. He had invited a small group to his townhouse for an informal evening, cards, conversation, nothing that required performance, and Edmund had come, which he did more frequently now, and Isolde had come with Clara, and at some point the evening had separated itself into its constituent parts, Clara at the card table with Mr. Ashfield, Aldrich in debate with Lord Fenwick about something political, and Edmund and Isolde in the library because neither of them had wanted to play cards. The library was warm and slightly chaotic. Aldrich's books had been arranged by color at some point and never corrected, and they had been talking for 20 minutes about nothing consequential when Edmund crossed to the desk to find a particular volume he'd mentioned, and a letter slipped from between the pages and fell to the floor. He picked it up. The movement was ordinary. But his face, when he looked at it, was not. Isolde watched him go very still in the way she had learned meant something was happening inside him that he was working hard to contain. "Edmund," she said quietly. He looked up. He had forgotten, for a moment, that she was there. She could see that. He had gone somewhere private and had been caught in it. "I'm sorry," he said. He folded the letter. "It's nothing." She said nothing. He sat down. "It's her handwriting," he said, after a moment. He looked at the folded paper in his hands with the expression of a man looking at something that had already hurt him as much as it could and so had lost the power to surprise. Aldrich kept one. "I didn't know." A pause. "She wrote to him." "Near the end." "About what?" Isolde asked, carefully. He was quiet for a long time. "About me," he said. "About my mother." He set the letter on the table between them. Did not unfold it. "About what she had discovered." The fire crackled. Somewhere beyond the library door, Clara laughed at something Mr. Ashfield said. "You don't have to tell me," Isolde said. "I know," he said. "That's why I want to." He told her in pieces, the way one dismantles something structural, carefully, in the right order, because the wrong order would bring everything down at once. His marriage had been arranged when he was 24 and Eleanor was 22. This much she knew. What she didn't know was that Eleanor had not been indifferent to the arrangement. She had been, in fact, quietly devastated by it, because she had spent the previous 2 years in love with someone else. Someone unsuitable. Someone his mother had identified and systematically removed from Eleanor's life before the engagement was announced. "She told Aldrich?" Isolde said. "She suspected my mother knew more than she admitted." "About why the previous match dissolved." He paused. She was right. Cressida had known about Eleanor's attachment. Had known, and had managed it. A word, a suggestion in the right ear, a social door quietly closed. Not cruelly. Never cruelly. With the smooth efficiency of a woman who understood that sentiment was something you afforded when the important things were already secured. Eleanor had married Edmund knowing what had been done. Had said nothing because there was nothing to say. Had been civil, and then quietly unhappy, and then something beyond unhappy that didn't have a clean name, and Edmund had watched it happen and not known the shape of it, not known that his wife was grieving something his own mother had taken from her. She found a letter, Edmund said. My mother's. Written to the man, before. Explaining, very politely, why continued contact would be inadvisable. He looked at the fire. Eleanor found it 2 months before she died. Isolde was very still. The fever, she said. And then, carefully, was it a fever? The silence was the longest yet. The physician said yes, Edmund said. And I chose to believe him. Because the alternative, he stopped. The alternative meant that my mother had set something in motion years before, and I had not seen it, and Eleanor had died knowing that the man who was supposed to be her husband had been too blind or too selfish or too. He broke off. Edmund, Isolde said. I found my mother's letter afterward. Going through Eleanor's things. His voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been broken and reset so many times they no longer tremble. My mother has never acknowledged it. We have had 3 years of perfect silence on the subject. And I have spent those 3 years not knowing whether I am mourning a woman I failed, or something worse. Isolde looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the small table between them and placed her hand over his. Not with drama. Simply, there. Present. You are not responsible for what your mother did, she said. I am responsible for not seeing it. You were 24. You trusted your mother. She kept her voice even, because even was what he needed. That is not the same thing as complicity. He looked down at her hand on his. Something moved across his face, complex and unresolved, like weather over open water. You are the only person, he said, very quietly, who has made me feel that might be true. She came to Wrenmore House on a Thursday. Edmund received her in the drawing room because refusing her would have required an explanation he wasn't ready to give, and Cressida knew this, which was why she came without warning. She sat across from him with her tea and her composed expression and spoke first about trivial things, the season, a distant cousin's engagement, and Edmund waited with the patience of a man who knew the real conversation was still in the hallway. You are spending a great deal of time with Miss Vane, she said, eventually. Yes. Edmund. I'm not going to explain it to you, he said. Pleasantly. In the tone he had learned from her, in fact, warm on the surface, with the real meaning held slightly underneath. It isn't a subject I'm prepared to discuss. Cressida set down her tea. She isn't suitable. I'm aware of the conventional view. It isn't convention. It's practicality. A duke cannot. Mother. He looked at her directly, and something in his expression made her stop. I know about Eleanor's letter. The room went very quiet. Cressida's face did not change. This was one of her great talents, her face very rarely changed when she didn't want it to. But her hands, Edmund noticed, stilled completely in her lap. I don't know what you mean, she said. I think you do. He kept his voice level. I'm not going to have this conversation today. But I want you to understand that I know, and that the particular authority you have exercised over my choices for the past 3 years, he paused, is something I am reconsidering. She looked at him for a long moment. When she stood to leave, she was still composed. She was always composed. But at the door she paused, and said, without turning, she will ask you questions you cannot answer comfortably, Edmund. Women like that always do. Yes, he said. That's rather the point. She told Clara that night. Not everything, not the letter, not the full architecture of what Cressida had done, but enough. The shape of it. The weight of it. What it meant to love someone who was carrying something this heavy. Clara listened with the serious attention she reserved for important things. "Do you love him?" she asked, when Isolde finished. The question sat in the small bedroom they shared, lit by a single candle, very honest in the way that late-night questions between sisters tend to be. "I think I might," Isolde said. "Which is inconvenient," Clara offered. "Enormously." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He trusts you. You told me yourself, he doesn't trust anyone." "Trust and love aren't the same thing." "No," Clara agreed. "But one without the other doesn't last." She looked at her sister with the clear-eyed wisdom she occasionally produced, which always slightly startled Isolde. "What are you afraid of?" Isolde thought about it honestly. "That I'll stay," she said. "And it will cost both of us more than we have. His mother. Society. The whole machinery of it." She paused. "And that I'll leave, and spend the rest of my life thinking about a man in a corridor who said you're right like it was the most relieving thing anyone had ever said to him." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, "That second one sounds worse." Isolde looked at the candle. "Yes," she said. "It does. It was Cressida who forced it." Isolde had not gone looking for a confrontation. She had been at a morning call at Lady Aldrich's when Cressida arrived, and there was no graceful exit, and so she stayed and watched Cressida work the room with the smooth efficiency of long practice and waited for the moment she knew was coming. It came in the garden, where Cressida followed her during the brief interval when the other guests were occupied. "I told you," Cressida said, without preamble, "that this would complicate his recovery." "You told me he was fragile," Isolde said. "He isn't. You don't know him as I do. I know that you removed a woman from his life without his knowledge, and that woman died unhappy, and that your son has spent 3 years believing the guilt was entirely his." She said it quietly, because quiet was more accurate than loud. "I know that you came to a dress shop to discourage me not because you were protecting Edmund, but because you were protecting yourself." Cressida was silent. "I'm not your enemy," Isolde said. "I'm not trying to expose you or ruin you. But I will not be managed." She met the older woman's eyes steadily. "And neither will he. Not anymore." The garden was very still. "You have no idea," Cressida said softly, "what it costs to hold a family together." "No," Isolde agreed. "But I know what it costs not to." She paused. "I think you do too." She went back inside and did not look back. Her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her. That evening, Edmund sent her a note. It contained one line. "I would like to tell you the rest of it, if you'll hear it. E.A." She wrote back. "I'll hear all of it. IV." She sealed the letter and gave it to the footman and sat for a long moment in the small sitting room of their rented house, listening to Clara practice scales in the next room, thinking about the word all and what it meant to mean it. She meant it. That was the terrifying and clarifying thing. She meant it entirely. He told her on a Friday afternoon in Aldrich's library, which had become, without either of them formally deciding this, their place. Not because it was romantic, it wasn't, particularly. The books were still arranged by color and there was a persistent draft from the east window that no one had fixed. But it was the room where he had first told her something true, and truth, Edmund had discovered, was territorial. It preferred familiar ground. Isolde sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and her expression arranged into the particular quality of attention he had come to rely on, not soft, not braced, simply present. Ready for whatever came. He told her about the morning after the funeral. His mother's face across the breakfast table, composed, as always, already managing, already looking forward to what came next. The way she had said we must think about the estate before Eleanor had been in the ground 24 hours, and how Edmund had understood even then that something was wrong with his own response, because he had thought yes, you're right instead of how can you. He told her about finding Eleanor's things. The letter. Reading it once, in the cold of Eleanor's dressing room, standing because he couldn't bring himself to sit. He told her what he had done with it, nothing. He had done nothing. Had folded it and put it in his coat and carried it back to his own rooms and sat with it for 3 days and then burned it, not because he wanted to destroy evidence of anything but because he couldn't bear to look at it anymore. Because every time he did he saw Eleanor's face in those last months, the distance, the quiet, the way she had stopped fighting him and simply receded, and understood that what he had interpreted as her nature had in fact been grief. Specific, caused grief. With a specific cause he might have found, if he had looked. You couldn't have known, Isolde said. I should have asked. You were 24 and you believed your mother and your wife was not telling you something she had decided to carry alone. Her voice was steady and precise. You can hold yourself accountable for not asking without holding yourself accountable for the whole of it. Where is the line? I don't know exactly, she said. But I know it exists, and I know you've been standing on the wrong side of it for 3 years. He looked at her. How do you do that? He said. Do what? Say the thing that is both completely true and completely. He stopped. Uncomfortable? I was going to say necessary. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something that was careful and decided at the same time, like a woman who had already made a choice and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. Edmund, she said. What do you want? Not what is practical. Not what society requires. Not what your mother thinks. She held his gaze. What do you want? The question sat in the room between them, very honest and very simple. He had not been asked this in so long that he had to sit with it for a moment before he could answer. This, he said finally. Whatever this is. He gestured between them, the library, the afternoon light, the two of them sitting across from each other in a room full of wrongly ordered books. You. Talking like this. Being known. She nodded slowly. Then that's where we start, she said. He went to his mother's house on a Saturday morning. This was unusual, he did not call on her unannounced, as a rule. She received him in her morning room with the faint surprise of a woman who had been expecting something but not yet this. Edmund, she said. Mother. He sat down without being invited, which was also unusual. I'm not here to argue. I want to say something, and I'd like you to hear it without interruption. She folded her hands. Very well. I know what you did, he said. I have known for 3 years. I have said nothing because, he paused, considering the true reason, because I wasn't ready to accept what it meant. And because a part of me believed that if I never said it aloud, I could continue to believe my own silence was mercy rather than cowardice. Cressida said nothing. Eleanor deserved better from both of us, he said. I intend to hold myself accountable for my portion of that for the rest of my life. But I am finished holding yours as well. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you this not to hurt you. I'm telling you because I intend to live differently than I have been, and you should understand why. The vain girl, Cressida said softly. Her name is Isolde, Edmund said. And yes. His mother looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him, past the composure and the careful management, in the way she rarely permitted herself. He saw something move through her expression that he couldn't name. Not guilt, exactly. Something older than guilt. Something that had been living in her a very long time. She'll make you uncomfortable, Cressida said finally. Constantly, Edmund agreed. It's one of the things I value most about her. Cressida turned to the window. I did what I thought was right, she said. For the family. For you. I want you to know that I believe that. I know, Edmund said. That's the part that makes it hardest. He left without resolution, because some things don't resolve, they simply find a new shape to exist in, one that is less destructive than the old one. He walked home through a London morning that was almost warm, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like a man moving towards something rather than away from it. London noticed. It couldn't help it, the Duke of Renmore, who had been faithfully tragic for 3 years, was now attending things. Smiling, occasionally. Being seen in Hyde Park with a woman whose father had been a solicitor and whose dress, while perfectly respectable, was not the dress of someone who had any business being in Hyde Park with a duke. The opinions were varied and loud. Lady Harcastle revised her position twice in a single week, first declaring it a brief amusement, then a serious infatuation, then something she had privately suspected all along. Mrs. Fenwick began a 5th stanza. Lord Fenwick told her to stop. The younger women were largely sympathetic to Isolde, because the story had the shape they recognized from novels and approved of instinctively: unsuitable woman, impossible duke, love that required courage to claim. The older women were more divided, which was more interesting. She's sensible, Lady Aldrich said, at a tea where the subject was being comprehensively analyzed. Surprisingly so. You can see it, she doesn't perform. That's precisely the problem, said someone else. A duchess must perform constantly. Perhaps, Lady Aldrich said, that depends on the duke. Aldrich himself, when Edmund told him directly, said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then, I have been waiting 3 years for you to find a reason to be alive again. That's dramatic, Edmund said. You burned a letter and wore black for 3 years rather than speak to your own mother. I'm allowed to be dramatic. He raised his glass. She'll be good for you. She already is. Edmund said nothing. But he didn't disagree. He asked her in the library. Of course he did. It was evening, late enough that the candles had burned down to something warm and low, and Clara had been collected by Lady Aldrich's carriage an hour ago, and they had been talking about nothing important for 40 minutes, which had become one of his favorite things, the particular ease of talking about nothing important with someone whose company made everything feel significant anyway. He didn't plan it. Or rather, he had been planning it for 2 weeks in the abstract, rehearsing versions of it in the silence of Renmore House, and then the actual moment arrived and all the rehearsed versions left and what remained was simply the truth. I would like to ask you something, he said. She looked at him with the expression that meant she already knew, and was waiting, and was not going to make it easier for him, which he appreciated. I am not an easy proposition, he said. I have a complicated history and a mother who will require managing and a title that comes with obligations you didn't choose and a tendency towards silence that you will find frustrating. I've noticed, she said. I'm aware of what I'm asking. I'm asking you to take on something that will cost you socially, at least initially, and that will require you to navigate a world that has very specific ideas about who belongs in it. Edmund, she said. I'm nearly finished. You're stalling. He almost smiled. Yes. He looked at her directly. I am asking because I have been, for 3 years, a man performing a life rather than living one. And the only time in those 3 years that I have felt genuinely present is in this room. With you. A pause. I would like, if you're willing, to spend a considerable number of years being present with you. Isolde was quiet for a moment. That, she said, was the least romantic proposal in the history of the English language. I know. It was also completely honest. Yes. She looked at him with the expression he had catalogued over months, the one that was assessment and warmth and the particular intelligence that had seen through him from the very first evening. "Yes," she said. "Simply that." He exhaled. "Yes," she said again, with the slight smile she reserved for moments when he was visibly relieved. "Stop looking so surprised. I decided weeks ago. And you didn't tell me? You needed to get there yourself." She tilted her head. "You usually do." He reached across the small table, the same table where she had placed her hand over his the night he told her about Eleanor, and took her hand properly this time. Outside, London continued its noise. Inside the library, with its wrongly ordered books and its persistent east window draught, two people sat in the candlelight and were, simply, there. This scene is quieter than the others. It takes place in the garden at Wrenmore House, on a Sunday in late summer. Edmund and Isolde have been married for 7 months. The Tun has largely adjusted, as the Tun always does. Scandal has a shelf life, and a duchess who is genuinely interesting turns out to be more compelling than a duchess who is merely appropriate. Cressida comes to call. This is not unusual. She calls monthly, always on Sundays, always for exactly 1 hour. There is a careful choreography to it that all three of them maintain, not because the past has been resolved but because resolution is not always the goal. Sometimes the goal is simply continuation. A relationship that has survived its own worst moment and found a new, lesser damaged form. On this particular Sunday, Cressida arrives to find Isolde in the garden with a book and Edmund beside her with correspondence he is not reading because he is watching her read, with the particular expression of a man who still finds the ordinary extraordinary. Cressida stands in the garden doorway for a moment before either of them notices her. She watches her son's face. She has not seen him look like that, unguarded, unburdened, simply content, since he was very young. Since before she made the choices she made, with the good intentions she had, for the outcomes she was certain would be best. She thinks about Eleanor. She does this more than she allows anyone to know. She thinks about what it costs to hold a family together, and what it costs not to, and Isolde's voice in the garden saying "I think you do too." Isolde looks up and sees her and says, pleasantly, "Lady Cressida. Come and sit, Edmund's been pretending to read for 20 minutes. Edmund looks up. "I was reading." "You haven't turned a page." "I was rereading." Cressida walks into the garden and sits in the chair that is waiting for her, and accepts the tea that arrives without being asked for, and watches her son argue mildly with his wife about whether he was or was not reading, and feels something loosen, very slightly, in the part of her chest where the old decisions live. Not forgiveness. She is not certain she deserves it yet, or that she has earned the right to ask. But something. Something that might, in time, grow into it. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Wrenmore. He did not stop wearing black immediately. This surprised people who had expected a dramatic visible transformation, the grief discarded, the mourning ended, a symbolic new chapter announced to the Tun with appropriate ceremony. It didn't happen that way. What happened was quieter and more permanent. He began, gradually, to wear gray. Then deep blue. Then, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning 8 months into his marriage, a dark green coat that Isolde had not suggested and did not comment on, only looked at with the particular expression that meant she had noticed everything. He never entirely shed the reputation. The Tun's stories are adhesive, and the Duke who loved so deeply clung to him for years even as the actual man contradicted it in every observable way. He stopped minding. The story was theirs. The truth was his. He reconciled with his mother slowly, in increments, over years. There were Sundays in the garden and Christmas at Wrenmore and grandchildren who called her grandmama with the easy affection of children who know nothing of old griefs and need know nothing of them. Full reconciliation never came, some distances, as Mrs. Poole had said, couldn't be fully crossed. But they built a relationship in the space that remained, and it was honest in a way that the old one, for all its smoothness, had never been. He thought about Eleanor. Not every day, not after the first year. But on certain mornings, in the library, he would sit with the memory of her quiet face and hold it with the care it deserved, and the guilt was still there, reshaped but not gone, and he had made his peace with the fact that it might never go entirely. He had told a woman in a corridor that he was very good at looking like he was grieving. He had been right. What he hadn't known then was that he would one day grieve honestly, for Eleanor, for the marriage that should have been kinder to both of them, for the years of performed sadness that had been easier than the real kind, and that honest grief, unlike the performance of it, had an end. He reached it. It took time. But he reached it. Isolde Ashford, Duchess of Renmore. She was not, by any conventional measure, what a duchess was supposed to be. She said what she thought with a frequency that alarmed people who had never encountered a woman who did so without malice. She continued reading books that were considered too serious for drawing-room conversation and discussed them anyway. She remembered the names of servants and asked after their families and did not consider this remarkable, which itself was remarkable. The ton adjusted. The ton always adjusts, given enough time and enough evidence that the unconventional thing is not going away. What she had not entirely anticipated was the weight of it, not the social weight, which she had prepared for, but the emotional weight of being the person Edmund allowed himself to be known by. It was not a burden, exactly. But it was a responsibility she took seriously, the way she took all serious things seriously. She thought, occasionally, about the woman she had been before that first London season, practical, purposeful, making herself useful in the background of her sister's story. She had not expected to have a story of her own. She was glad she did. Clara married Mr. Ashfield in the spring, a genuinely good match, which Isolde had quietly facilitated from the background with the same efficient attention she applied to everything. Mr. Ashfield had kind eyes and considerable patience and loved Clara with the uncomplicated warmth Clara had always deserved. Isolde danced at the wedding with the specific happiness of a woman whose primary objective has been accomplished and who has somehow, against expectation, also accomplished herself. She had 3 children. 2 daughters and a son, all of whom inherited her habit of direct observation and Edmund's habit of saying nothing when they were thinking the most. She ran Renmore House with the quiet authority of someone who understood that power operated best when it didn't announce itself. She never stopped reading. She never stopped saying the precise thing that made Edmund feel worse and better simultaneously, and he never stopped needing her to. Clara Vane, Mrs. Ashfield. She lived happily and well, which she had always deserved, and never once said "I told you so" about Edmund, which she had also always deserved credit for. She said it only once, at Christmas, 15 years later, when Isolde made a mild comment about how unexpected the whole thing had been. Clara looked at her sister over the dinner table with the serene certainty she had always possessed about matters of feeling. "I told you," she said, "at Hyde Park. Second week of the season." Isolde considered this. "You said he looked at me strangely." "I said not like that." Clara smiled. Which meant exactly like that. Edmund, from the other end of the table, looked up from his conversation. "What are you two discussing?" "Nothing," Isolde said. "Hyde Park," Clara said, at the same moment. Edmund looked between them for a moment with the expression of a man who had learned, over many years, that some conversations between sisters were not for him. He returned to his own conversation. Across the table, Isolde met Clara's eyes. "She did not say you were right. She didn't need to." The myth. For decades, in certain drawing rooms, in certain corners of certain London seasons, someone would mention the Duke of Renmore and someone else would say, "Oh, the one who grieved so beautifully?" And the first person would say, "Yes, that's the one." And neither of them would know, because neither of them had been in a corridor outside Lady Pemworth's drawing room on a February evening, that the grief had never been what they thought it was, and that the story they were telling was not the real one. The real one was quieter, less elegant, more difficult and more true. It went like this. A man performed a life for 3 years until a woman told him she could see through the performance. He let her. That was all. That was everything. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.